Okay, not as many as I thought. All right, that's good. Just checking. Just want to make sure it's, if we need you on the street corner telling everyone to come to all of our events, then, that's what we need to do. I love it. I'll go ahead and folks get settled here. It's nice to see something other than gangsters or boat builders draw a crowd. We might break your record, Jay. No. Just kidding.
By the way, every chair that we have in here is being used. Just want to say that.
He's not being stingy and refusing to put anything out.
Sarah, do you account?
We do. Yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Yep. We do. All right. They're scavenging a few extra chairs from the study carrels and places, but we'll go ahead and start with introductions. Although I should probably double check with Dan to make sure he's recording because he'll yell at me if I don't. So now where did he go? Well, he can get this part. He knows this part by heart. Anyway, I'm Sarah Hansen, the Executive Director at the White Bear Lake Area Historical Society, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you tonight. Thank you for joining us. We have a monthly program series with the library, Ramsey County Library, and we've actually been doing this since 2011, which seems like a really long time ago. But, in the frame of history, probably not so much. But anyway, we've been doing it since 2011, and there are a handful of topics that draw a crowd like this, and I'm not surprised that Manitou Island is one of them because it's sort of at the heart and soul of our community and of the lake, of course. So we'll go ahead and dive into some of that. As part of that, I just want to acknowledge Ramsey County and the library system for bringing these programs. These are part of a what they call legacy programs, which are funded through the legacy, the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment through the state of Minnesota. And then, of course, we wouldn't be able to do what we do without our members at the Historical Society. So if you are a member, thank you. If you are a future member, thank you. Janine would be happy to help sign you up in the back. So she's back there flagging. But anyway, we would love to have you join us. So with that said, we'll go ahead and jump right in because I'm guessing that we'll have a good crowd, or we have a good crowd, and I'm guessing we might have some good questions as we go. So, so the island that what we know today as Manitou Island, it first appears not accurately depicted, as you can see, but first appears as a blob in 1843 on Joseph Nicolet's map of the upper Mississippi. Nicolet was hired by the U.S. government to go out and map this area, really the upper Midwest. So the Dakota, what we know today is the Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, all of that area, Iowa, a whole huge chunk. And interestingly, we've got a couple of books I've been reading about his journeys, a couple of journals and things that he kept. And it's really kind of fascinating because most of his information, whether he actually saw these places or not himself, because of course he didn't cover every square mile on it personally, but he took information from people who had, and particularly from indigenous guides. And so it's interesting because things that made it onto the map, and you may have heard me say this before because we use this map, reference this map a lot, but things that made it into this map, and this is a tiny little piece of it, but are things that were important, were significant to the indigenous people. And so the fact that Bears Lake in any way, shape, or form shows up on there is an interesting thing. The next place, and one of the next places, they're the most common place probably, that the island gets referenced, if you will, is through Mark Twain's Life on the Mississippi. Now, I find this one thoroughly entertaining, and if you've ever had this conversation with me in the past, I say this a lot, and I know some of you will sort of laugh, but ultimately the version, so Twain wrote about the legend of White Bear Lake in Life on the Mississippi, and it's the most repeated version of the legend. There are at least a dozen versions that we've come across over the years, and they all have some common threads. What I find entertaining is that we take this version and we put it on things like the historical marker in the park by the gazebo and other places. This is actually a slightly different version of it, from a letter that was written in 1855. But we take this version and promote it all over the place. Mark Twain's version promoted all over the place. And if you actually read the book, the paragraph or so before he goes into the legend, he references it and introduces it as the most idiotic Indian legend he has ever heard. So context can be important. Now, to be fair, the version, well, there's a couple things going on there with Twain. The version that he's telling, and of course Twain is Twain, so you have to take it with a grain of salt. But the version that he's telling is probably romanticized a bit, certainly not surprisingly. The other piece that I find interesting is that you never know how he heard it exactly, but people push that he was here. People tell us all the time that Mark Twain spoke here. He spoke at the Chautauqua. He did all these things. The closest we can put Mark Twain is riding on a train through town from St. Paul to Duluth in the middle of the night. So he would have come through here at about midnight and not seen a thing. But he did refer to White Bear as being the resort at one point as well. So we'll take it. Anyway, so the earliest version of the legend that's been written down is the one that is completely captured on the marker, and that is written by a gentleman named Byron Smith in 1855, and he wrote it down, wrote it in a letter to family members, and was sharing the information on the legend itself. Interestingly, he talks about lovers being in an elm tree on the island, and that the tree that they had snuck off. The whole legend talks about unallowed love, if you will, disallowed love, and the fact that they had to sneak away to be together. And the tree, the elm tree, where they would meet, it was supposed to have been a certain point on the island. And so interestingly, that elm tree actually has succumbed to Dutch elm disease many, many years ago. But the people who owned the property at the time carved the trunk into a bear to commemorate that. And then the bear has been replaced a few times now because it's not survived well. But kind of an interesting, we try to hang on to those things, or the community tries to hang on to those things. So while the Indian legend or Native American legend is something that we can't quite pinpoint the origins of, there's something to it, of course. And certainly we would never debate the fact that there was a Native presence in White Bear and on the island, absolutely. One of the physical pieces that we hear about is what you see here. Vic Richards, who was an accomplished and skillful sailor of boats, which he was a captain for several of the different fleets around the lake at different times. But he was for whatever reason, it made it in the paper. And if you have ever encountered the St. Paul Globe in the 1870s, 1880s, you'll know that if you sneezed, it probably made the paper. So not surprising. It's wonderful for us because we can find all sorts of interesting things, but they did have a lot of things they captured, I guess. Anyway, so ultimately, I do find the last sentence of this statement interesting. It said, Mr. Richards, so he found what they're referring to as a spearhead made of agate that was actually embedded in a tree on the island. But what I find entertaining is it says, Mr. Richards has presented it to the State Historical Society to be placed in their cabinet. We do a lot more. We are not the State Historical Society, but we do a lot more than just place them in a cabinet or put things like that. So kind of interesting. And we do know for a fact that there were at one time as many as 10 burial mounds, native burial mounds from Highway 61 to the island, essentially along Lake Avenue. And the island itself was very well known as a place for sugar camp, to have a sugar bush. So and I find that I love the evidence of that, if you will, that remains today, because if you ever walk along Lake Avenue in the fall and you see all the beautiful maple trees changing color out on the island, you can absolutely see that maples were very much available and are very much available, and you can certainly consider the fact that that would be a very logical place to have a sugar bush. So anyway, you can see here, although this is an interesting picture, this is a 1932 aerial view of the island itself, and you can see how dry things are. So the marsh that we know of today, that's not an uncommon phenomenon, if you will, but it's interesting to see how very dry. We use this photo, there's about 24 photos in this series from 1932 that are fascinating to show the different conditions around the area during that particular time period. So the island, of course, it fluctuates a little bit with the water levels, but the island is approximately 53 acres of land. And once that area, what we know today as Minnesota, was surveyed and opened to settlement and to purchase, the entire island was sold as a chunk. It wasn't sold off in pieces, or lots or anything. It was sold as an entity, as a parcel, a few times. So it's kind of fascinating. The original owner, one of the original owners, was a gentleman named James B. Murray. And Murray's owned pretty much, in fact, actually the island there were a couple of owners who did this. They owned pretty much the island and all along Lake Avenue from 11th or 12th, all the way down to what is the highway in those original, they just bought huge tracts of land initially. And it was often because they wanted to be able to harvest timber or do different things, or that was the plan anyway. They weren't certainly planning to live there. The Murray family did come to town and did settle here eventually, and they had lots of land that they did different things with. They actually had a resort hotel on Lake Avenue at one point. So ultimately, James B. Murray sold the island to his brother-in-law, George Burson. Can't talk, I'm getting tongue-tied tonight. George Burson. If you are ever driving around just to the west of us, over here west of Clark, there's a little tiny street called Burson Avenue. That's named for George Burson. But he owned the island briefly, and then at one point he sold it to a gentleman named Joel Whitney, who purchased the entire island in its entirety. Joel Whitney was a well-known photographer, very, very early photographer in St. Paul. And so Whitney had his studio there. It's interesting. He certainly didn't settle on the island. He didn't build a house or do anything, but he did own it for a brief period. So kind of intriguing. He is the one who sold it to William Dean and R.M. Newport, who were representatives of the Manitou Island Land and Improvement Company. They purchased the island as a whole, in August of 1881, and you see the St. Paul Globe reporting on that. You can see the Articles of Incorporation for the Island Association, the Land and Improvement Company. At that point, it incorporated with 14 initial shareholders, and those shareholders, as often happens, those shareholders came together for the purchase. They didn't all necessarily stay involved. They didn't necessarily keep their shares or stay as part of it, but they did come together for that initial piece. And then, and several of them did not build homes on the island. There was quite a changeover in the first few years, but they started building pretty quickly. But right away, in November of 1881, the construction of a bridge was authorized by the state legislature, and they started doing other things to improve the space. So you see here that C.H. Bigelow and Clark and Newport came out to visit the island and check things out. They decided at that point, or they were establishing the minimum value of the lots. So they started surveying and platting out the island lots themselves, and found that the bridge was almost finished. Oh, and my batteries might be dead. Thank you. Can you go ask? Oh, yeah, they're double A's. And they might last, but I don't know. Anyway, so they found that the bridge was underway. I'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment, but this particular bridge, the original bridge, you can see, was significantly longer. Yeah, I'm going to lose the battery. Was significantly longer than what we see there today. Interestingly, the early progress is, as we said before, included the establishment of that bridge itself, which I can only imagine. I don't know the exact cost on that one, but I do know that between the bridge, the clubhouse, 2 barns, and the grading of roads, and the improvement, hopefully Dan will be back in a minute, the improvement of the harbor, which were expected to, or were authorized not to exceed a cost of $20,000 in 1883. If you can imagine, that's about $660,000 today. So just trying to get things up and running had a significant cost, as you can imagine. So interestingly, what they did then was those shareholders who had the opportunity, okay, that didn't work. Hold on. Technical issues. Okay, no, I can't. There. I'll let you do that. So those shareholders who were a part of the island entity at that point were able to essentially bid on the lots that they wanted. So their shares entitled them to a lot. They didn't necessarily pay X amount for the lot. They paid for their shares, but then they were able to go into sort of a lottery and a process to select their particular lots and locations on the island. Hello, there we go. Okay. Thank you, Dan. Okay, back in business. So what I was saying is that it was an interesting process. You didn't purchase at that time your specific lot. You had your shares that you purchased in the association, and then you were able to select your lot. So they were all divvied out, and there were rules involved. So as it says, they had to pledge to build a cottage. You couldn't just buy it as a speculator or someone who wanted to hang on to the land and do something with it later. You had to actually commit. And if you didn't, there were specific rules that if you didn't commit and you didn't do it, if you didn't fulfill your pledge to build a cottage, you were out. You lost it. You lost your chance to do that. So they were pretty strict in that regard. You can see here the initial map of lots, and so you can see how they're all broken out. They did have various prices, different dollar values to them when you were picking them out as far as location goes and all of that. But this map is fascinating, and if you hang around with us at all at the Historical Society, you know we love maps in many, many ways. But it's just an interesting way to look at all of the different pieces. And of course, the central clubhouse and park area is still an entity, but you see the common or the park space down toward the end of the island. You see the little harbor area up here. Some of those things are just not what they were mapped out. Some of those things are not that way today. Let's put it that way. Have changed dramatically. And then you can also see the different names as they go around, and some of the houses that are already footprints being popped up there. So kind of an interesting piece to sort of fixate on. The early investors in the island company actually saw a shakeup in February of 1883 as things began to grow and happen. And several of those original investors, so as I mentioned, the people who jumped to the 14 who jumped in initially, sort of reshuffled, and some of them remained for sure, but there were about half of them actually pulled back and sold their pieces or got out of the process. So kind of an interesting disruption, if you will. And then people got serious about their investment in it. The Manitou Island company actually built the clubhouse and the center, and what is today what we just saw as the park, sort of in the center of the island, and built it as a clubhouse and a dormitory. So in those early years, it was used for a number of things. It would have been used for communal living in the sense of A lot of times, summer cottages, like the Philip Brown house that we have at the Historical Society, did not have kitchens. They were purposely not built with kitchens because of the heat and the fire danger. And so the clubhouse would have been used for communal dining as the families came. It also had sleeping quarters upstairs, and so that you could have different options there if you're, for whatever reason, your cottage wasn't available or you needed to do something, or had guests coming that for some reason you couldn't fit in your home, or have different opportunities. So the clubhouse didn't last very long. It only lasted about 20 years, but it was initially planned, interestingly, for the north side of the island. You can see lot 62 was staked out for the clubhouse location. And then fairly quickly, they decided, the Island Association Board decided that a lakefront lot probably wasn't worth sticking the clubhouse on. And so they wanted to have that available for someone to develop. And so it was very quickly moved into the inland, if you will, and where the park ended up being. It was used for many, many things from the get-go. It's kind of interesting. So this particular advertisement or notice in the St. Paul Globe again talks about the fact that Mrs. Noyes, Mrs. Wheelock, Mrs. Carey, and Mrs. Young were giving a concert and a hop at the clubhouse for the Women's Work Exchange of St. Paul, which was a group that helped women get set up with work, who helped them train, who helped network and connect them with others, opportunities and things. So an interesting use of the building. What I find fascinating about that is the fact that Emily Gilman Noyes, who you see on the left there, and her husband Charles were the ones who had the Philip Brown house. I just mentioned the Philip Brown a few minutes ago. The Philip Brown house, constructed on the lake shore at Lake and Moorhead. The Philip Brown house is the historic house that the White Bear Lake Area Historical Society owns and operates today. It was built in 1879. They had that built and only spent a couple of summers there before the island became available, and they moved out there and became part of that. Now, when they did that, when they built it and then sold it, they sold it to George and Ellen Young. So it's kind of entertaining that it's the two of them putting on this opportunity, fundraising opportunity, and benefit on the island. So both of those ladies are significant to the history of the Philip Brown itself. The clubhouse, like I say, was used for many years, or for about 20 years on the island in different ways, but it's interesting. We don't know for sure who designed it. There was a plan that was created by an architect named J. Walter Stevens, but nothing ever says for sure that he was the one, that was the plan they used. Now, it very likely is, but we don't know for certain. There's always speculation that Cass Gilbert, local architect, who we'll talk about in a few minutes, was the designer. I don't think so. That doesn't mean he wasn't, but we were pretty well versed on what Gilbert did, and I don't think he designed it. He did, however, live in it and do some renovations on it, which I'll show you in a little bit, or we'll talk about a little more as we go. But first, we're going to cover the bridges real quick. So you saw that original long bridge, really long bridge. The bridge we have out there today is the fourth bridge, which is interesting because it's about a fourth of the length of the original bridge. Each time they built a new one, it got shorter. It was cut in about half, or cut down significantly. The other thing that I find really fascinating is that this bridge, the original bridge, is said to have been bright red, which is not shocking. A lot of things were red, painted red back in the day, but black and white photographs, you obviously don't see that. And it's one of those things that when we came across it in different references and minutes and notes and things, it gives you a whole sort of different perspective of that scene, I guess, if you will, of the lakeshore and seeing the bridge out there. The second bridge was proposed. The second bridge came along fairly quickly, actually. The original bridge, like I said, was built in 1881. That photo was about 1890 or so. By 1903, that original bridge needed major repairs. or a total replacement. And so it was proposed to the village council, because White Bear was a village at that point. It was proposed by the island company, the land improvement company, to the village council that they wanted to just continue 4th Street. So you see 4th Street coming along here, and have the bridge just continue on as an extension of 4th Street, which is an interesting idea for a lot of reasons. What I find fascinating about that is the village actually said, sure, that's okay, as long as you're paying for the bridge, which of course made it a really long bridge, at least as long as the original one, probably longer based on what you're seeing there. This map is from 1908, so it gives you kind of a sense of what they would have been dealing with. The other thing that I find fascinating that you can see on here is that the area around the bridge was designated as park even at that point. Interestingly enough, this lot up here, lot 2 as it's called, or as it's labeled there, is also designated as park. That's residential now, so it is definitely not a park at this point. But in those early years, that park, which today we know it as Matoska Park, in those early years, it was identified as Canary Park, and we still don't really know why. There are all sorts of thoughts, but nobody knows exactly where that came from. So shortly thereafter, the second bridge comes into play, and you can see that it's much shorter than the first one, about half the size or so of the first one, and you can see that they've built up on the edges and really kind of pulled it out there to minimize the bridge a little bit. And then many of us probably remember this one. This was the third bridge. This is actually, you can actually see well, maybe you can't so much in this particular shot. We've got a couple of shots of it, but you can see warnings. Well, I guess maybe up here. The bridge was not in good shape at this point. This is about 2000, right before it was going to be replaced. And this bridge had been built right around World War II. And so it had lasted quite a while, but it was not surviving at that point and needed to have a new one put in. So interestingly, the current bridge, like I said, was completed soon after that picture was taken, with the cost being borne by the Island Association and therefore the residents. Today, that's who makes up the association. And for decades, that bridge, the third bridge, the one we just saw, had appeared as, or had functioned in many, many ways as a fishing pier, for better or worse, as a fishing pier, which was a bit of a hot button issue as the new bridge was being constructed, because in order to construct the new bridge, the new plan had the bridge being a single lane, and without space for it, it would have been dangerous for people to be fishing off the sides of it. It's a challenge from that standpoint. And so it took a little while for the city and the Island Association to come to terms or figure out a solution to that. But that is actually how, as I understand it, how part of the fishing pier down by the VFW was funded and put in place to offset and give another opportunity for fishing and be able to keep people safe. Oop, no, going wrong way. Keep people safe and there we go. Okay. So another landmark besides the bridge that comes with the island is the gates, the fieldstone gate. And there are several. What I love about those is that we have, there's certain things around town that are photographed and that are recorded heavily. These gates make all sorts of postcards from the early 1900s and whatever. It's kind of fascinating to see where those postcards end up, where they've been mailed off to, and how they come back to us. But so one of the things that's interesting about this particular shot is the sign on the right-hand side there. Privacy and public safety have been a concern for island residents and the community as a whole for many, many years. And as early as the minutes of 1886, the board authorized the purchase of a gate of sorts near the bridge. And the instruction or the installation of a sign notifying people that the island was private property happened in June of 1900. So you'll see different signs over the years. This one is fairly nondescript and fine. What I find interesting is that we have some from the 1950s or 60s that are actually like banners hanging over from light posts as you approach the island that say it's private property, different things. So it's kind of an interesting way. The other thing, this picture does not blow up super well, but you can actually see the caretaker, kind of. It's almost like a Rorschach test or something. But you can see the caretaker sitting there at his post at the gate as well. So this is a picture of the gates from the island side as you leave. And you can, what I find fascinating about this is actually the bridge and the walkway on the side of the bridge as you exit out that way. And again, these gates pop up in all sorts of different photos and postcards and different things. So lots of views through the years. So I mentioned the caretaker. So again, we like fours around here for some reason. We're on the fourth bridge, the fourth yacht club building, lots of fours. There were 4 caretakers officially in the island's history, and Casper Bloom was the first and one of the most prolific. He was caretaker on the island for 38 years, if you can imagine. So, and he took his job very seriously. He had a variety of duties, as you can imagine, serving as gatekeeper. In those early years before electricity came to the island, he would have to go out and light the street lights, the gas lamps, and then go out and extinguish them every morning along the road to make sure that people could see where they were going. Electricity didn't get to the island until 1898, so he did that for quite a while. And he certainly kept an eye on things. He was not a house sitter per se, but he did rounds and kept an eye on things when folks were not in town or not occupying their cottage. The island was exclusively a summer residence, summer cottage, summer development, if you will, in those early years. So he had a lot of time that he had to keep track of things. And especially in the winter, when no one else was there, he made twice daily trips around to make sure that everything looked the way it was supposed to and there weren't tracks in the snow and all sorts of other things. And they actually said that in his later years, he himself rarely left the island itself. He was there a lot, and he took it very, very seriously. So he was they had the caretaker's cottage, which you see here, it was used by the caretakers, as you can imagine. It would have been just when you first got onto the island on the right-hand side, and sat there for many decades. Once Casper Bloom was finished with it, once he had passed away, actually. Al Burroughs was the next caretaker from 1922 to 1939. And he had actually been a steamboat captain and village marshal and was considered well qualified for the role of being island caretaker. And then the third was Conrad Johnson, who served from 1939 to 1971, when his daughter Bonnie and her husband Raleigh took over the duties as caretaker. So as you can tell, there was longevity. Clearly it was a pretty decent job to have because they stayed for a very long time. And the cottage, certainly wasn't too shabby. It was built and used by all of the caretakers at various points. This was about 1990 when they did a major remodel and kind of brought it into the new era, if you will. And certainly it was used for a little bit longer. By 2000, the Island Association determined that they didn't really need, the people were living there year round. It wasn't the same kind of place. And they didn't really need a caretaker on site. And so they rented out the house for a little while. And then eventually had it moved off the island, which is an interesting endeavor. This was in 2009, I believe, 8 or 9. And we'll see in just a second here. But moving something like that, as you can all imagine, is not an easy process, nor is it a fast process. So it's sort of inched along. And I can remember vividly being out there, and it drew a lot of attention, as you can also imagine. We have lots of urban legends about things being moved across the ice. The Geist gazebo in the park right by the bridge being one of them, which did not get moved across it was planned to be moved across the ice, but it was a warm winter and they chose not to do that. St. John's Church, which is just down the street here a little bit, not the current building, but the original wooden structure was moved across the ice. The White Bear Town Hall at one point was moved across a portion of Goose Lake, not White Bear Lake, and there were several other houses that have been moved this way. I think that they probably didn't. I think this was a much more careful move than some of them, because we know of a couple that have dipped through the ice as well. But this is one of my favorite parts of that whole move. I think this is hilarious. So this is a newspaper, the Gulf Daily News in Bahrain. And I'm fairly certain the point of this is they're nuts in Minnesota. So I find it fascinating, and I have to laugh because this is me. And a couple of other folks from the Historical Society all standing out there. And even my kids, who are young adults now, but they were fairly young at that point, I made them go out there. We had to go see it on the, as it was moving and whatever. And I laugh because even now they'll say, you won't drive on the ice for anything, but you drove the car out there to take a picture of that. And I said, well, I had to get the right angle. And the lake level, as you might recall, during that time period was fairly low. So, we weren't going to drown, but still an interesting piece for sure. So it has been moved. It has been moved off the island into a private lot in the neighborhood, just at Johnson and I was going to say, okay, thank you, and remodeled at this point, and so it's being repurposed, which I think is fascinating. But always an interesting story to tell folks that, well, that's how that happened. The other cottages that did not get moved, certainly off the island, but most of which sadly do not. In fact, I don't think any of these particularly, well, I guess they do. It still remain, but the Caretakers cottage isn't the only cottage that was notable by any means, and it certainly, several of them had either made newspaper stories, which this is actually part of a spread that was done in one of the papers with etchings of different cottages. It was big news, and promoters loved to push the fact that cottages, businesses, buildings, things were being done, things were happening in these different communities. And certainly if others were investing in the community or in this project or this entity, you should as well. So that was pretty typical, which we are very fortunate to have, because then we have etchings and information. One of the most notable things about the island over the years has been the level of architecture that has actually been out there. And so there have been homes or properties over the years built or designed by Cass Gilbert, Clarence Johnston, and Edwin Lundy, who are the three you see there. And we've got the ones that we know have a connection, at least. Gilbert is by far the most prolific, as you can see, but these are some of the house numbers, the addresses, if you will, of those cottages that were originally built. Sadly, almost all of them are gone at this point, or altered dramatically. But one of our favorites, as you can imagine, is that cottage I mentioned that the Noyes family built, Charles and Emily Noyes. And this photo, so Cass Gilbert is actually the gentleman standing there. It's an interesting small cottage. In fact, if you are familiar at all with the Villa Brown house, it's more of a Swiss chalet kind of style to it. And they went from that to this, which is much more rustic, much more simple. But they were, for whatever reason, that's what they wanted. This little photo is something that we were able to capture from a scrapbook of Cass Gilbert's that is held at the Library of Congress. And it's kind of comical because we were not flipping the pages. This is one of those things where I kind of laugh. They had, at the Library of Congress, if you want to look at archives like this, you have to have someone turn the pages for you, which is fine. I respect that. I had to laugh in talking with the poor woman. She has 2 PhDs, and she was stuck standing there turning the page. And they said, okay, next. But it was wonderful to have her help, and thankfully. But as she turned the page, this was a tiny little snapshot popped out of it. And I said, we need to scan that. I know what that is, and I want that picture. So it's kind of a fun one to actually be able to have. And you can see on the map there that's where the C.P. Noyes cottage was. Another that is an interesting one and particularly fascinating to me is what you see here is the Morton cottage. Again, style-wise, very different from some of the things that you might expect. This was another modest cottage credited to Gilbert. It belonged to Walter S. Morton and was constructed in 1891, so a little bit after some of the others. Morton was the president of the St. Paul and White Bear Electric Railroad, which would soon be developing Wildwood Amusement Park on the Matamini shore. Morton and Stone, which is another one we don't have a picture of, but They were together in the amusement park and railway company for a number of years, and had some interest. They actually pulled Cass Gilbert into doing some work at the park as well in later years. Here we see that we're getting a little bit larger in the styles and not quite as modest. This is the Jasper Tarbox cottage, which was located at 2517. It's much more what Cass Gilbert would have been aspiring to do. He was he really wanted to do grand things, and of course he went on in later years to do the Minnesota State Capitol, to do the U.S. Supreme Court building, to do a couple of other state capitals actually, and all sorts of much larger university and library and bank buildings and things like that. So cottages weren't really his, especially modest ones, weren't really his thing, but this was early on in his career. And so, but this is kind of a fascinating elevation of the Tarbox cottage in those early years. Another was one that he referred to, oh, that's not good. Hang on. It's lovely, but not exactly what we're looking at the moment. Anyway, another one that he referred to as the house at Acorn Point, and you can see down that actually is marked that way down in the corner. This one still stands. It was it's been altered greatly, but you can see it not too long ago, I think. Come on. Don't freeze up on me now. There we go. Not too long ago, and you can see the remnant. I believe it's been remodeled again since this point, but you can see that how the bones of it at least were there at that time, and in that particular capture. And then one of my favorites, just because it's stately and grand, but it doesn't, it's a Cass Gilbert, but it doesn't really feel like him at all, other than maybe some of his university buildings and things like that. But this is the Dean Cottage, which sat out, it's gone now, but it sat toward the end of the island and had quite the prominent position out there when the trees were dead and leafless and whatnot. But you can see what it would have looked like with the dock and all the pieces. Where'd my notes go? All right, so then we jump to the Bement Lion Cottage, which always gets a little bit interesting because ultimately this building or this particular structure had some interesting notes in it, or some interesting discrepancies, I guess, with it. So when you look at the cottage, the building, Gilbert has some wonderful ledgers and things that were available in a couple of different collections, historical archives that we've been able to go through. Now, if you look at the notes at the top, it says RBC Bement is the owner, Tracy Lyon Cottage. And so it's gone back and forth over the years as to who exactly and what exactly was going on there. More than likely, Tracy Lyon was managing the property and doing things, but then there was actually a Lyon Cottage at one point that is referenced on the property, so it becomes a little murky for that one. So if anybody has information, we'd love to be able to piece it together a little bit more. The next architect who only had a couple of designs out there, did a lot of things in the Twin Cities in general. Clarence Johnston, if you're familiar with the University of Minnesota Johnston Hall, he is responsible, that is named for him, and he did a number of buildings out at the university. He also has a number of houses and places in Delwood and kind of around the area, but not as many on the island as Gilbert. I think Gilbert just happened to be there at the right time in the vicinity and was working on things. But, excuse me. So you can see here what Johnston was working on, the Gotzian Cottage. He's credited with the original design of this, which would have been completed in 1883. Gotzian was best known for his company that manufactured shoes and boots and his service in the Minnesota legislature. So not surprising that he would have a beautiful summer cottage. And then this is the Carey Cottage. Johnston also designed this early version, which doesn't look as much like him. He had a little bit more of the kind of long and almost more like the tar box with Gilbert, but this is a little more cottagey for him. Interestingly, this one originally sat between 2520 and 2510, which are the addresses on the island, and got picked up and moved to 2523. So it got picked up and moved because, again, we moved things like Tinker Toys, and it wasn't a big deal back then, but was moved to the Reinhold Noyes family, their property, and was used by them for a number of years. Reinhold was the son of Emily and Charles, one of the first settlers on the island, or one of the first developers on the island. And then we have Edwin Lundy, who was a much more contemporary architect. He was around quite a few decades later, after Gilbert and Johnston would have moved on. By 1900 or so, they were on their way to bigger and better things, if you will. And Lundy was just getting started, really, at that point. He did work as a draftsman under Gilbert for a while, under Cass Gilbert, and he considered himself primarily to be self-taught. Architecture wasn't necessarily a big education sort of thing. There weren't degrees in architecture like there are today. Cass Gilbert, for example, did go to MIT for a year and then left that and decided to do his Grand European tour instead, because that would be better training for what he needed for experience and drafting and all of that. So interestingly, what I love about Lundy is that not only did he design things in this area, he did a lot of work along the North Shore. He designed a lot of cabins and cottages and things along the North Shore. So he's sort of the next generation of cottage life or cabin living. But he did a couple of the cottages on the island in earlier years. This was actually it was done initially in the 1920s, when Weyerhaeuser's had the original house razed, torn down, and hired Lundy to design a new year-round home for them. So a little bit different twist on things, not necessarily just a summer cottage. The guest house that they had was later moved across the ice and relocated into Delwood. The Lundy, what I love about him, like I said, is that he not only designed homes for others in the area, he actually he lived in Manitou. I mean, he was a local guy, and his house in Manitou still stands today. He's passed away, but his house still stands. So kind of a fascinating twist, if you will, to some of that. This is certainly not a grand house on the island, but one that I love. I love this picture just in general. But this is the Taylor Playhouse, because the original house on the property had been built by Oscar Taylor in 1891 and included this little log cabin playhouse on the edge for his son Donald, which was said to be the envy of all of Donald's playmates in the family notes, and I'm sure somewhere probably in the St. Paul Globe, because, why not? But then Lundy designed the one that still stands and still really is true to its design, true to its style and whatnot, is what is known as the Weed Cottage on the island. And we actually had this on our historic house tour back in 2007 or 8, and it's a fascinating house. But there are a number, and in fact, the Schrader Area Historical Society up on the North Shore often does, I'm not sure if it's annually or if it's biannual, but they do an Edwin Lundy tour along the North Shore, which is really quite interesting, and some of those styles and things still remain. But anyway, so the island has many, as you can imagine, as you've heard, the island has many special things to make note of. And one of the things that I particularly love about it is the sense of community over the decades and the ongoing celebration, the realization that it is a very unique place. And so it's kind of fun. In fact, there might be a few folks in the crowd who might show up in some of these pictures, so be forewarned. But ultimately, the certain social activities have been significant and important over the years. Obviously, the centennial in 1981 was a big deal. And then one of my favorites is the Manitou Days parade, or not the Manitou Days, I'm sorry, the 4th of July parade that brings everyone out and neighbors, connecting with neighbors and being able to participate out in the park and all of that. And then I have to laugh. I don't think Dick is here, but This is one of my favorite pictures from the parades that makes me laugh. It's probably completely inappropriate, but very fun, and kind of gives you the style of being silly and having a good time with things. So, as I've said a couple times, the island is very special. It's clearly was a special place from as early as Native American days on through the stories and the legends and the different kind of lore that comes with it. It has captured the attention of many publications, as you can see. These are just a couple, but many publications throughout the years. One of the things that I find entertaining, again, is that these are obviously color and magazines and newer things, but this is a rewrite, but pulling a quote from 1852 from James Goodhue, who was one of the first newspaper people in St. Paul. And he says, "In the midst of the lake, like a vast flower pot, is an island crowded with rock maple trees that you can scarcely see to read by daylight. A vast temple of trees, and in the shadowy aisles of which are birds that sing most sweetly, of a plumage that shows them to be strangers to sunlight." And it goes on and on and on. And at that point, it was actually owned by a gentleman named William Freeborn, and again, sold in chunks or as a chunk throughout the different times. But a fascinating place to be sure, with lots and lots of history. And you can see, I find it entertaining that the aerial photo I showed a little while ago was from 1932 with low water levels. And you can see almost exactly the same, it's a different angle, the photo's taken from a different angle, but you can see almost exactly the same kind of marshy, low water area in 2008 in this particular photo. So that's the end of the official part of the program, but I'm happy to try to entertain questions.